"Sir, are you sure you know how to fly?" The question echoed through the packed Boeing 737 like thunder cutting through sudden silence. Every eye turned toward that weathered man with graying hair, worn clothes, and a face carved by time and hardship. Some passengers laughed nervously, others clutched their armrests in fear. Nobody could imagine that in just 30 minutes, this same man would save the lives of over 290 people aboard, transforming suspicion into respect and silence into thunderous applause. On that flight from Atlanta to Miami, nobody could have guessed who he truly was. It was an overcast Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport when Flight 447 began boarding. The cabin filled quickly with hurried business executives and excited tourists heading to South Beach. Among them, a simple man entered slowly, wearing a faded navy blazer with frayed cuffs, a yellowed white shirt, and carrying an ancient leather briefcase held together with duct tape. His disheveled salt-and-pepper hair and exhausted eyes drew immediate attention. His name was James Mitchell, 61 years old. From a distance, he looked like just another worn-out blue-collar worker, carrying his battered case with a distant, hollow stare. To many passengers, he seemed like some poor soul who'd probably scraped together enough for a discounted ticket. When he settled into the window seat of row 23, a well-dressed woman beside him visibly recoiled, wrinkling her nose. "Oh my God, is he really going to sit here?" she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. The silence that followed was thick with judgment. A flight attendant approached with barely concealed suspicion. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her tone dripping with doubt. He handed it over calmly. She examined it thoroughly, returned it without a smile, and walked away. James simply turned his gaze back to the window, but the contempt didn't stop there. A young man in an expensive suit complained loudly, "This is ridiculous. I paid good money for this seat, and they seat someone like this next to me? He probably reeks." Snickers rippled through several rows, but James didn't react. He only took a deep breath with the serenity of someone who'd heard far worse in his lifetime. Then suddenly a passenger a few seats ahead gasped, his eyes widening in shock. "Wait! No way! Is that really you?" James lifted his weary eyes and recognized him immediately. It was Derek Chambers, a former high school classmate from their days in small-town Georgia, now clearly a successful businessman judging by his Rolex and tailored Italian suit. Derek's initial surprise quickly twisted into a cruel smirk. "Well, well, well. James Mitchell, the guy who was supposed to be the smartest kid in our class." He laughed loudly, making sure others could hear. "Look at you now, man. Dressed like a homeless person while I'm flying first class on my way to close a $1 million deal in Miami." He stood up, leaning over his seat to make sure everyone nearby could witness the humiliation. "You always had your nose in those books talking about becoming somebody important. And this is what you became? Pathetic. Really pathetic." Several passengers watched the exchange uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others seemed entertained by the cruel spectacle. The flight attendant who'd checked James's boarding pass earlier whispered something to her colleague, both glancing at him with pity mixed with disdain. James remained calm, his voice steady and quiet. "Life takes unexpected turns, Derek. I may not have luxury anymore, but I have peace. That's what matters." Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "Peace? That's what losers say when they've got nothing else. Enjoy your peace back there in cattle class, buddy." He returned to his premium seat, still chuckling. The woman next to James shifted even further away, practically pressing herself against the aisle. A teenager across the way took a photo discreetly, probably for social media mockery. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the atmosphere remained tense. The sky outside had grown darker, storm clouds gathering ominously over Atlanta. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we're aware of some weather ahead. Should be some turbulence, but nothing we can't handle. Sit tight." Within minutes of takeoff, the aircraft began climbing through increasingly violent air. The seatbelt sign dinged urgently. What started as mild bumps quickly escalated. The plane suddenly dropped several feet, causing screams throughout the cabin. Carry-on bags shifted overhead. A child began crying. Then came the sound nobody wants to hear on an airplane. A loud thud from the cockpit, followed by frantic voices over the intercom, quickly cut off. The head flight attendant emerged from the cockpit, her face ghost white, her hands trembling visibly as she gripped the seats for support against the turbulence. "Is there anyone aboard?" Her voice cracked with panic. "Anyone at all who knows how to fly a plane?" Panic erupted instantly. Passengers exchanged terrified glances, mothers clutched their children, and several people began praying aloud. The plane lurched violently to the left, causing more screams to pierce the cabin. "What do you mean, can fly a plane?" a man shouted from the front. "Where's the pilot?" The flight attendant, Sarah, fought back tears. "Captain Henderson collapsed. Heart attack, we think. The first officer is trying to control the aircraft, but he's overwhelmed. We need help now!" The turbulence intensified. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments, swaying like pendulums of doom. The aircraft's warning systems blared in the background. Through the windows, passengers could see nothing but dark, churning clouds and lightning flashing in the distance. "We're all going to die!" someone screamed. Derek, the businessman who'd mocked James earlier, had gone pale, gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles were white. "This can't be happening! This can't be happening!" Sarah stumbled down the aisle again, her voice breaking. "Please! Is there a pilot? Anyone with flight experience, please!" Silence. Desperate silence filled only with the sounds of crying, praying, and the ominous creaking of the aircraft's frame under stress. Then, from row 23, a calm voice cut through the chaos. "I can fly it." Every head turned. James Mitchell was standing, one hand steadying himself against the overhead compartment, the other already unbuckling his seatbelt. His exhausted demeanor had transformed. His eyes, which had seemed hollow and distant just minutes before, now blazed with focused intensity. Sarah rushed toward him, hope and desperation fighting in her expression. "Sir, are you serious? This isn't—" "I'm serious," James interrupted firmly. "I've flown before, many times." Derek's voice rang out, sharp with disbelief and fear. "Are you insane? You're going to let some homeless-looking guy into the cockpit? He'll kill us all!" Other passengers murmured in agreement, their fear making them hostile. "How do we know he's telling the truth? This is crazy. He looks like he can barely afford a bus ticket." The woman who'd been sitting next to James stood up, her voice shrill. "I will not let my life depend on him!" But Sarah, seeing something in James's eyes, a certainty, a competence that couldn't be faked, made her decision. "Sir, what's your full name?" James looked directly at her. "Captain James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired." The cabin went dead silent except for the howling wind and protesting engines. Sarah's eyes widened. "Come with me, now." As James moved toward the cockpit, the plane dropped again, throwing several passengers against their seatbelts. James pushed through the cockpit door and immediately assessed the situation. Captain Henderson lay unconscious on the floor, the flight attendants having dragged him aside. The first officer, a young man barely in his 30s named Tyler, was drenched in sweat, his hands shaking violently on the controls. "Thank God," Tyler gasped, his voice cracking. "I've only got 200 hours of flight time. I've never landed in conditions like this. We're losing altitude fast, and I can't. Move over," James said calmly but firmly, sliding into the captain's seat. His hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the throttle, checking the instruments, his eyes scanning the displays with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Tyler stared in disbelief. Who are you?" "Someone who's been doing this longer than you've been alive," James replied, already communicating with air traffic control. "Atlanta Center, this is Delta 447. We have an emergency situation. Captain is incapacitated. I'm Captain James Mitchell, former Air Force, assuming command." There was a pause on the other end. Static crackled. Then a voice came back, stunned. "Did you say James Mitchell? Call sign Ironclad Mitchell?" "Affirmative." Another pause. "Sir, we have you on radar. You're at 18,000 feet and descending in severe turbulence. Closest suitable airport is Atlanta, but you're fighting a Category 3 thunderstorm. Wind shear at 45 knots. James's jaw tightened. "Understood. I'll need the ILS approach for runway 27R, and I need emergency vehicles standing by." "Roger that, Captain. You're cleared for emergency landing. Sir, the controller's voice softened. Godspeed. Behind them, through the partially open cockpit door, passengers could hear fragments of the conversation. Some began whispering. Did he say Air Force? Is he really a pilot? Maybe we have a chance. But Derek's voice carried loudest. This is insane. He's probably lying. He probably washed out of some flight school decades ago. Sarah, the head flight attendant, snapped back. Shut up and sit down, or I'll have you restrained. The plane shuddered violently, tilting at a sickening angle. Screams erupted again. James fought the controls, his muscles straining, sweat beading on his forehead despite his calm expression. Years of military training had prepared him for this, flying damaged aircraft through hostile territory, landing on carrier decks in storms, pulling off maneuvers that would make civilian pilots faint. But this was different. This wasn't just his life. It was 290 souls depending on him. Tyler, James said quietly, I need you to monitor our airspeed and altitude. Call them out every 5 seconds. Yes, sir. Tyler's voice steadied slightly, having something concrete to focus on. Outside, lightning illuminated the dark clouds in brilliant, terrifying flashes. The storm seemed to be swallowing them whole. The aircraft bucked and twisted like a wild animal as James fought to maintain control. Every muscle in his body was engaged, his years of experience guiding every micro-adjustment. He could feel the plane responding slowly, grudgingly bending to his will. Airspeed 240 knots, altitude 15,000 feet, Tyler called out, his voice gaining strength. Good. Flaps to position 1, James commanded. In the cabin, passengers watched through the cockpit doorway, paralyzed between terror and hope. Some had their phones out, recording what they believed might be their final moments. Others clutched rosaries, Bibles, or the hands of strangers. A little girl in row 12 asked her mother, Is the man in the old clothes going to save us, Mommy? Her mother, tears streaming down her face, whispered, I pray to God he can, sweetheart. Derek sat frozen in his first-class seat, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone, a half-written text to his wife visible on the screen. I love you. I'm sorry for everything. Tell the kids. He couldn't finish it. The plane suddenly dropped 500 feet in an air pocket. Overhead compartments burst open, bags tumbling into the aisles. The screaming reached a fever pitch. Even the flight attendants, trained for emergencies, looked terrified, but James's voice remained steady on the radio. Atlanta Center, Delta 447, breaking through 12,000 feet, requesting vectors to final approach. Delta 447, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 8,000 feet. You're 12 miles from runway 27R. James made the adjustment smoothly, compensating for the violent crosswinds. His mind raced through calculations, wind speed, approach angle, touchdown point. He'd landed C-130 Hercules transports in Afghanistan sandstorms, F-15s on damaged runways, even a crippled B-52 with 2 engines out during a training exercise gone wrong. But that was decades ago. His body wasn't as sharp as it once was. His reflexes had aged. Doubt tried to creep into his mind. Altitude 10,000 feet, airspeed 210 knots, Tyler announced. Gear down, James ordered. Tyler hesitated, his hand hovering over the control. Sir, in these conditions, with the gear down, the drag, I know exactly what I'm doing, son. Gear down. Now, Tyler complied. The landing gear extended with a heavy mechanical thunk that reverberated through the fuselage. The plane shuddered even more violently, the additional drag making it harder to control. Several passengers vomited from the motion. Others had given up screaming, simply sitting in numb shock. Through the windscreen, James could barely see anything. Just gray chaos, rain hammering the glass like bullets, lightning crackling across the sky. They were flying almost blind. 8 miles to runway, the controller's voice crackled. Delta 447, we're showing severe wind shear at 500 feet. Recommend... I've got it, James interrupted calmly. His hands moved with surgical precision, adjusting throttle and stick in tiny increments, feeling the aircraft, becoming one with it. Then, through a brief break in the clouds, the runway lights appeared, twin lines of white and red stretching into the distance. I see the runway, James announced. Altitude 3,000 feet, airspeed 180 knots, Tyler called out, his voice tight with tension. The runway appeared and disappeared through the sheets of rain, like a mirage taunting them. James lined up the aircraft, fighting the crosswinds that tried to push them off course. The plane tilted dangerously to the right. Gasps erupted from the cabin. With decades of muscle memory, James corrected with the rudder, bringing the wings level. His forehead glistened with sweat, but his hands remained rock steady. "Full flaps," he commanded. "Full flaps, aye," Tyler responded, executing the command. The plane slowed, becoming even harder to control in the violent winds. They were at 2,500 feet now. The ground was rushing up to meet them, but the storm wasn't finished. A massive gust hit them broadside, shoving the aircraft 30 degrees off center line. In the cabin, people screamed. The woman who'd complained about James earlier was sobbing uncontrollably. "We're going to crash! We're going to die!" But Derek, watching through the cockpit door, saw something that silenced his earlier mockery. He saw James's face, not panicked, not uncertain, but focused with an intensity that could only come from a true master of his craft. This wasn't some washed-up failure. This was a warrior doing battle with nature itself. "Come on, old girl," James muttered to the aircraft, coaxing it like a beloved horse. "Just a little more. Stay with me." 1,000 feet, Tyler shouted. "Wind shear! Wind shear!" The automated warning system blared. "Sink rate! Pull up! Sink rate!" James ignored it. He knew what he was doing. Pulling up now would stall them and send them plummeting like a stone. Instead, he added power, just a touch, compensating for the downdraft that was trying to slam them into the ground short of the runway. 500 feet! The runway filled the windscreen now. Emergency vehicles lined both sides, their lights flashing red and blue through the rain. Foam covered the tarmac, prepared for the worst. James made one final correction, dropping the right wing slightly to counteract the crosswind, a technique called wing-low landing that few civilian pilots ever mastered. 200 feet, 100 feet, the plane crossed the runway threshold. James pulled back gently on the yoke, flaring the nose up. The main landing gear touched down with a slight chirp of rubber on wet concrete. Not a slam, not a bounce, but a kiss. "Spoilers!" James barked. Tyler deployed them instantly. The plane's speed brakes popped up, helping slow the massive aircraft. James applied reverse thrust, the engines roaring in opposition. The plane decelerated smoothly, tracking perfectly down the center line despite the howling crosswind. As the aircraft finally rolled to a stop on the taxiway, a moment of stunned silence filled the cabin. Then, like a dam breaking, applause erupted. Not polite clapping, but thunderous, grateful, tearful applause. People were standing, crying, hugging strangers, shouting thanks to God and to the mysterious man in the cockpit. James slumped back in his seat, exhaling deeply for the first time in 30 minutes. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. Tyler stared at him in awe. "Sir, I've never seen anything like that." James unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, his body suddenly feeling every one of his 61 years. "You did good, son. You kept your head when it mattered most." Tyler shook his hand with both of his own, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. You saved all of us." As James stood and turned toward the cabin, the cockpit door fully opened. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Every single passenger was on their feet, faces streaked with tears, hands raw from clapping. The sound was deafening. Sarah, the head flight attendant, was the first to reach him. She threw her arms around him, sobbing. "Thank you. Thank you so much." James awkwardly patted her back. "Just doing what needed to be done, ma'am." As he walked down the aisle toward his seat to retrieve his battered briefcase, the applause continued. People reached out to touch his shoulder, his hand, thanking him over and over. The little girl from row 12 gave him a drawing she'd made during the flight, a picture of an airplane with a smiling stick figure in the cockpit and the words, "My hero," written in crayon. James knelt down to her level, his eyes moistening. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll treasure this forever." Then he reached the first-class section. Derek Chambers sat there, his expensive suit rumpled, his face ashen. When James approached, Derek stood slowly, unable to meet his eyes. "James, Derek's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. The things I said, I was cruel and stupid and—" James placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "We all have our moments, Derek. What matters is what we learn from them." Derek's composure finally broke. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "You saved my life. After everything I said, you still saved my life. I don't deserve—" "Everyone deserves a second chance," James said quietly. "Even you." The woman who'd sat next to James, who'd recoiled from him in disgust, approached timidly. "Sir, I'm ashamed. I judged you so harshly. Can you ever forgive me?" James simply nodded. "Already forgiven." As the passengers began disembarking, news crews were already gathering outside. Word had spread quickly. A mysterious passenger had landed a commercial aircraft in one of the worst storms Atlanta had seen in years. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Airport security cleared a path for James, but before he could leave, a tall man in a pilot's uniform with 4 stripes approached. It was Captain Richard Morrison, Delta's chief pilot, who'd rushed to the scene. "Captain Mitchell," Morrison said, saluting sharply despite being in civilian aviation now. "I flew with you in the Air Force. Operation Desert Storm. You were my flight instructor." James studied his face, recognition slowly dawning. "Morrison? Little Ricky Morrison from Nevada?" "Yes, sir." Morrison's voice was thick with emotion. "You taught me everything I know. You saved 23 airmen when our transport got hit over Iraq. You're a legend, sir. What are you doing?" He gestured at James's worn clothing, the question dying on his lips. James smiled sadly. "Life after the military wasn't kind to me, Ricky. My wife got sick, cancer. The medical bills, they took everything. The house, the savings. My pension went to treatments that didn't work. She passed 3 years ago." Morrison's face fell. "Sir, I had no idea. Why didn't you reach out? The Air Force community, we take care of our own." "Pride, I suppose," James interrupted softly. "Stupid pride. I've been working odd jobs, staying in shelters sometimes. I was heading to Miami because my daughter lives there. She doesn't know how bad things got. I didn't want her to worry." Morrison grabbed James by both shoulders. "That ends today. You hear me? That ends right now." Within the hour, the story had exploded across social media. Videos taken by passengers showing James's calm walk to the cockpit, the terrifying turbulence, and the miraculous landing went viral. News channels interrupted regular programming with breaking news. Homeless veteran saves 290 lives in miracle landing. But James had already slipped away from the reporters, declining interviews, wanting only to fade back into obscurity. He sat alone in a quiet corner of the terminal, finally able to retrieve his old briefcase. Inside wasn't much: a change of clothes, a photo of his late wife Maria, his Air Force medals wrapped in cloth, and a worn Bible. He pulled out Maria's photo, his thumb tracing her smile. "I hope I made you proud today, my love," he whispered. "Excuse me, sir?" James looked up to find a well-dressed African-American woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She wore a badge identifying her as Rebecca Chen, Delta Airlines Executive Vice President. "Captain Mitchell, I'm so glad I found you before you disappeared. May I sit?" James nodded, tucking Maria's photo back carefully. Rebecca sat down, her expression serious but compassionate. "What you did today was extraordinary. But more importantly, we've learned about your situation, and frankly, sir, it's unacceptable that a man of your caliber and service has been struggling like this." "Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "Delta Airlines would like to offer you a position. We need experienced pilots for our training program, men and women who can teach not just the technical skills, but the composure, the judgment, the courage you displayed today. The starting salary is $180,000 annually, plus full benefits, including housing assistance." James sat stunned, unable to speak. Rebecca continued. "Additionally, a GoFundMe campaign started by passengers on your flight has already raised over $400,000 in the last 2 hours. People want to help, Captain. Please let them." Tears rolled down James's weathered cheeks. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Rebecca smiled. "Say yes to a fresh start. Say yes to letting people show gratitude. Say yes to honoring your wife's memory by living the life she would have wanted for you. James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, nodding slowly. Yes, yes, I accept. 3 months later, James stood in front of a classroom at Delta's Flight Training Center in Atlanta, wearing a crisp, new instructor's uniform. 20 young pilots in training sat before him, hanging on his every word as he taught advanced emergency procedures. The most important thing isn't just knowing the mechanics, James explained, pointing to a flight simulator behind him. It's keeping your head when everything around you is chaos. Fear is natural. Panic is a choice. After class, several students approached with questions. Among them was Tyler, the first officer from that fateful flight, who'd enrolled in Delta's advanced training program specifically to learn from James. "Captain Mitchell," Tyler said, "I wanted you to know. You inspired me to become not just a better pilot, but a better person. The way you handled those passengers who disrespected you, then saved their lives anyway. That's true character." James clasped his shoulder warmly. "You had what it takes all along, Tyler. You just needed to believe in yourself." Outside the training center, James climbed into his modest but reliable used Toyota, purchased with some of the GoFundMe money, though he'd donated most of it to veterans' charities and cancer research in Maria's name. He'd also secured a small apartment in a decent neighborhood and had reconnected with his daughter in Miami, who'd flown up immediately when she learned what had happened. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek Chambers. "Lunch next week? My treat. Want you to meet my family and tell them about the man who taught me what really matters in life." James smiled and replied, "Sounds good, my friend." As he drove home, he passed a homeless veteran holding a sign at an intersection. James pulled over, rolled down his window, and handed the man a $50 bill along with a card for the VA assistance program he now volunteered with. "Brother, there's help available," James said gently. "You don't have to do this alone. Call that number. They helped me, and they can help you too." The veteran's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, sir. God bless you." That evening, James was invited to a special ceremony at the Georgia State Capitol. Governor Catherine Walsh presented him with the Governor's Medal of Valor, the state's highest civilian honor. The chamber was packed with the passengers from Flight 447, news media, military veterans, and dignitaries. "Captain James Mitchell represents the very best of us," Governor Walsh announced. "A man who served his country with distinction, faced devastating personal loss with dignity, and when called upon in the darkest moment, rose to save nearly 300 lives without hesitation. He reminds us that heroism isn't about recognition or reward, it's about character, courage, and compassion." The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. But the moment that touched James most came when the little girl from row 12, accompanied by her parents, presented him with a framed version of her crayon drawing. On the back, her mother had written, "You taught my daughter that heroes don't always wear capes or look like they do in movies. Sometimes they look like ordinary people, until the moment they're needed most." 6 months after that storm-tossed flight, James Mitchell stood at the large window of Delta's Operations Center, watching planes take off and land at Hartsfield-Jackson. His reflection showed a transformed man, still weathered, still marked by life's hardships, but now standing tall, with purpose restored and dignity reclaimed. His phone rang. It was Sarah, the flight attendant from Flight 447, now a good friend. "James, turn on CNN. They're doing a special feature on you." He found a television in the break room. The segment was titled, "The Invisible Hero: How America Failed and Redeemed a Veteran." The report detailed not just his heroic landing, but the systemic failures that had left him homeless despite his decades of service. It sparked a national conversation about veterans' care, leading to new legislation and increased funding for veteran support programs. "One man's quiet dignity in the face of contempt," the reporter concluded, "reminded an entire nation of a truth we too often forget. Never judge a person by their appearance. The most extraordinary people often walk among us unnoticed until the moment we need them most." James turned off the television, emotion tightening his throat. Maria's photo sat on his desk nearby. He picked it up, tracing her smile once more. "We did it, my love," he whispered. "We survived the storm." That weekend, James returned to his small church in Atlanta, the same one where he'd sometimes slept in the basement during his hardest nights. But now he came not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone offering it, volunteering to help other veterans find housing, employment, and hope. As he served meals to those still struggling, a young homeless vet looked up at him with hollow eyes James recognized all too well. "Is there really a way out of this?" the young man asked desperately. James knelt down beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Son, 6 months ago, I was sitting exactly where you are. Today I have a home, a job, a purpose. The way out exists. But you have to be willing to accept help, and you have to never give up on yourself. Can you do that?" The young man's eyes filled with tears. "I can try, sir. That's all any of us can do," James smiled. "Try and keep trying. I'll help you. We'll walk this road together." Later that evening, as James sat in his apartment, modest but his own, he reflected on the incredible journey from that humiliating moment on Flight 447 to this new chapter of his life. He'd learned that rock bottom wasn't the end of the story, that dignity could be stripped away but never truly destroyed, that character reveals itself not in comfort, but in crisis, and most importantly, that the same hands that once judged and mocked could also applaud and embrace if given the chance to see what truly matters. James opened his laptop and began writing, not for publication, but for himself. He titled the document, "Lessons from 30,000 Feet." He typed, "Never judge a book by its cover. Today's broken person might be tomorrow's hero. Today's hero might be tomorrow's person in need. We are all one storm away from needing grace, and one act of courage away from giving it." As he wrote deep into the night, planes continued their endless dance across the Atlanta sky, taking off, landing, carrying people with their own stories, their own struggles, their own hidden depths. And James Mitchell, once invisible, once dismissed, now smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd weathered life's cruelest storms and emerged not bitter, but better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What did you think, and what would you have done in that situation? Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end, and don't miss tomorrow. I'll be back with more.